Did you know that US imports from China declined by $140 billion last year? And did you know that India's imports from China have risen by 55% in the last 5 years to $102 billion? And did you know that China's share in foreign inputs purchased by India has grown more than 4 times to 23%? Hello and welcome to another edition of Capital Calculus. I'm your host, Anil Padmanabhan. Last week, President-elect Donald Trump declared that he will impose hefty tariffs on imports from China, Mexico and Canada on his very first day in office, which, by the way, is 20th January. This action is bound to have global implications, including a probable vicious trade war. China is bound to react. In the first round, it is most likely to devalue its currency, making its exports that much more cheaper and attractive to the rest of the world. India too is vulnerable, especially since it's deeply dependent on intermediate imports from China and has a ballooning trade deficit. To unpack all these developments, I spoke to Ajay Srivastava. He is a former Additional Director General of Foreign Trade and the founder of Global Trade Research Initiative. But before we dive into our conversation with Ajay, here's a quick explainer on why and how India is so crucially dependent on imports from China.
The harsh reality of China's economic might is visible in the size and nature of its trade balance with India. While India's exports to it have either declined or at best remained stagnant, imports from China have surged in the last 5 years. In other words, reducing dependence on Chinese imports is an easy claim to make, but difficult to implement. Take, for example, India's lithium imports. In 2023 to 24, little under 2/3 of India's imports were accrued from China. The same narrative plays out for imports of electronics, telecom and electrical products from China. Explaining India's challenge, Anantha Nageswaran, Chief Economic Advisor, recently proposed, to the extent that some of this exposure seems unavoidable for some time to come, it may be useful to examine the ways in which the risks of such dependence could be mitigated. It is less risky to source the input through trade or by onshoring their production by encouraging foreign direct investment in India.
I began by asking Ajay how he sees the decision by President-elect Donald Trump to impose tariffs on Chinese imports plays out.
Initially, the world thought that Mr. Trump is imposing tariffs on China, and he was indeed the first one to impose tariff on China in 2018. But what we see later on, Mr. Biden has not only extended his policies, he expanded the coverage of the products and technologies on which the imports from China into US are to be restricted. And the US could see the results also. The Chinese imports into US has come down from $505 billion in 2017 to $427 in 2023. So a distinct fall is there. But the problem is the US still has a large trade deficit with China, $280 billion currently, because US exports to China are either agriculture products like soybean or their crude oil or some very high-tech products and aircrafts and ICs, etc. But look at what China exports to US. China exports laptops, smartphones, entire electronics range, so from washing machine to everything. And then they export most of the machinery to China, toys, sports goods, entire textiles and clothing, furniture, bedding, everything you name it, US doesn't figure. So I was wondering if US is raising tariffs on these, who gains? So as we have noticed that imports into US from China has come down, but it's very interesting to know uh, what's happening. Is US gaining from this? No. US, because of higher per capita income, higher hourly wages, they cannot manufacture most of these things in US. They can either manufacture the very high tech goods or aircrafts or ICs, or they can do good in agriculture using large farms. They are not in position to competitively produce electronics or toys or textiles or clothing, all those things. They have to rely on China. If not China, then on other countries. So what happened is US imports from China have come down, but these imports have shifted to countries like Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, and Mexico. And US is not happy about this. So you must have read that now Mr. Trump is, I think in March, he said that he will impose punitive tariff on Chinese firms going out of China and manufacturing things in other countries. So, so it's a quandary for me. US is not going to manufacture these things competitively. No steel, no clothing, no toys, nothing, and mostly no electronic. They can be good in very high end products or agriculture products. So other countries will gain. That means US workers is they are not going to gain. That's the basic election plank for action against China, and other countries will gain. And if we go further, supply chains they have many layers. Top tier you can remove China. For example, now solar cells they don't come into US from China. They come from Vietnam. So, but polysilicon is manufactured in China only. So Vietnam buys from China and converts into solar cell and exports to China. So ultimately, it's easy to dislodge China from the tier one of the supply chains, but it will take years to dislodge China from tier two or tier three. From so, US workers is not going to gain. Other countries may gain, and and it will be total unsettling of the global supply, supply chains.
Even if the US succeeds in dislodging them from tier one, there are consequences for the rest of the world because China has the problem. They don't have domestic demand. The only way they can fuel their economy is through exports. And their exports are genuinely competitive, price competitive. So, what happens to the rest of the world? Countries like India, if China decides to weaponize their exports,
I see China following two strategies to deal with the restrictions put up by US and largely also by the European Union. Two strategies are one, of course, to keep their factories running to full capacity or even partial capacity, they need to dump the products here and there. So they are focusing on Southeast Asian market, which is ASEAN countries and India. And these countries have seen the surge in imports. You see Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, everywhere surge in import has happened. Even in India, we see the continuous uh, increase in imports from China. So I will not call it dumping. I say China is good, but in certain cases they will be dumping, and we should be on the watch out for more occurrences of dumping and other things. And if you recall, sir, in 1996 or 7, when India removed the quantitative restriction from the imports, we set up a war room in Ministry of Commerce to monitor the surge in imports from China on day-to-day basis. I think the time has come. And the proper action emanating from your question is that Ministry of Commerce should set up a war room to monitor the imports of from China of top 100 products on day-to-day basis. If any surge is there, they should be immediately taking actions like anti-dumping, safeguard duties, or increase in import restrictions or increase in normal tariffs. So these are the normal tools. So this is one thing, how to check the surge of imports. But second, it's difficult to handle the second thing, which is China makes most of the products. Say penultimate part of the product. Say in solar panels, they make up to polysilicon or even solar cell. And then Vietnam imports solar cell from them or polysilicon from them and processes it and adds 10-15% value, makes solar cell into solar panel and exports to US or India or anywhere. People will say imports from China have come down, but your country imports have not come down. And in the heart of that product, China still remains fully functional. And third of there is a third dimension also. Chinese firms shift their production. For example, Chinese steel firms, they have gone to Indonesia and Mexico and many more countries. And some of Indian firms also collaborating with Chinese firms to manufacture in China, steel manufacturing in China. So those things we have, steel manufacturing in Indonesia. So the steel manufactured with the JV with Indian firm and a Chinese firm in Indonesia will come to India tariff free under the India ASEAN FTA. So these are the many nuances, and we have to be conscious about all these things and take action in advance. We should not be taken by surprise.
What about tariffs? Whatever you said, I guess tariffs won't work either, right?
Uh, so tariffs we have seen, for example, toys. So we increase the tariffs say from 20% to 30% to 40% to 50% to 60%. But two problems with tariffs are there. For example, if I take the example of solar panels, China produces 80% of the world's solar panels, and Vietnam and other countries, including India, we buy solar cells from China and convert into solar panels. That is a mechanical work. It's not any fine engineering work. So if you increase tariff, for example, India has increased the tariffs on solar panel to 40% and solar cells to 25%, so that people bring solar cell, not solar panels. But we should know that solar panel accounts for 85% of the value of the product. And are we really gaining or losing? This, of course, tariff comes to the coffer of government. But ultimately, since we are dependent on China for this product and we need the product, tariff will only increase the price. It will not hurt China because they're the sole supplier, almost the sole supplier. As I said, if you see the trade data, you can see a lot of supplies from countries like Vietnam, but they buy from China, do some value add, and then send to India or Europe or America. So tariffs in such cases where China is a monopoly, for example, APIs, for example, solar cells, for example, lithium-ion batteries, they are the monopoly. If you increase the tariff, you increase your cost. Tariff will help where you are competitive and you are beaten by some price margin of 10, 20, 30%. But if you are buying from a monopoly supplier, then tariffs will you will hurt yourself only.
As recent as 2005, the trade relationship between India and China was not so skewed. So it's curious to know what changed in the last 20 years that India has now become so import dependent on China for intermediates.
Indian economy is expanding, and we needed intermediates for those things, and because we are a high cost economy, our cost of production is higher compared to many countries, and ease of doing business needs a lot of improvement, and because of that, deep manufacturing is not happening in most sectors. You see electronics or chemicals, we buy intermediates and then process that to make the final product. And final product is needed for domestic consumption and or for exports purposes. But intermediates we almost stopped making, like APIs. I was telling, we were exporting more than China was doing, but we stopped making because of cost factors and maybe because of dumping from China. We can say that. But right now, economy is expanding. We are making products from the raw material stage is expensive, so we started buying more and more of intermediates. And China was the main supplier because they did wonders in their country. They invested in making of the intermediates in a big way. So we started buying not only APIs, most of the organic chemicals, most of the machinery we needed, we started buying from China, and most of the electronics, of course, we buy everything from China. So if I have to summarize it, I say Indian economic demands increased. Local industry was not equipped to supply that, or at best they were converting intermediates into final products, and that's why our dependence on China is increased. That's a simplistic explanation.
I think you mentioned that one of the factors inhibiting domestic production was the cost. How do you explain this cost? Is it because of red tape? Is it because of cost of capital? Or is it lack of logistics? What is it?
Sir, I think everything, if we go to textbook economics, people talk about factors of production, land, labor, power, all those things are there. So, land, we know acquiring a land is difficult. It's not only expensive, the process takes up to 2 years in many cases. I visited China many times and I see their industrial sheds ready, approved. For example, I saw one chemical shed shed which was open for any chemical unit to go and start production there, and mechanical electronic sheds, they were ready, pre-approved. Here industry comes, they have to buy the land and they have to take approval. It takes a lot of time. There China, everything is pre-approved, so that plug and play, we call it. And in budget this year, we heard the announcement that government will be establishing 100 plug and play type of industrial parks. So I'm eagerly waiting for that to happen. If that happens, things will improve. So one is land, then our power. Power, it's not UPS, uninterrupted supply of power, and many of the industries, they go for their captive power plant. This increases the cost of power, and it creates another problem of pollution and emissions of carbon dioxide. And then so power, then capital. Our capital is generally 12 to 14% is the cost, and MSME doesn't get even that. Banks ask for collaterals, and so all these things, they are factored into making up the cost. When I talk to foreign investors, and then they say, okay, if I'm making in say Vietnam, my cost disability compared to China is 5%, India is 12% for a particular product. How your PLI or other incentives? My only sole aim is to fill this gap of 12%. If you can fill that, of course I'll settle in India happily. You have a great domestic market, but everybody is concerned about high cost of production. Then of course, ease of doing business. We talk a lot about this, and many good steps have been taken in the past, but lots needs to be done. For example, exports. Why it needs to take 2 to 3 days time to export and 3 to 4 days time to import a thing? It should be now, everything should be through an app, online, everything for most of the products. So we need to work on those things. I think we have not looked deep into these areas. We need to look at both the areas, reducing the cost of production and promoting ease of doing business. And we can do that only if we say we have a problem. Yes,
Actually,
sir.
you're so right. Because wherever government involvement is minimal, like say tech, the our IT industry is a great example. They do exceedingly well. Wherever government processes, red tape is involved in manufacturing or any other activity, we see they struggle because of processes. I mean, the union government is one problem. State governments are another story altogether. So I totally agree with you. I think we are a very 100% friction economy, India, not a zero friction economy like say China.
I agree, sir. So I think that improvement will come next. First, we should admit and record everything that this is the problem. For example, I want to open a restaurant or I want to open a school. How many permissions are needed? How many days are needed? We have to admit these things are a problem. We don't admit. That's why it will take time to improve.
Ajay is spot on. India's Achilles heel is its domestic competitiveness, which poses a strategic risk to India. Beginning 20th January, the world is likely to see a tariff war or a trade war. This is a moment when Indian industry and Indian competitiveness is going to be severely tested. Because what is likely to happen, as Ajay explained to us, is that China is likely to devalue its currency and flood the rest of the world with cheap exports. Given that domestic capability and competitiveness is suspect, India becomes extremely vulnerable to cheap Chinese exports. Yes, India can take mitigation actions to weather this storm, but it does not take away from the fact that India has to ramp up its competitiveness on a war footing. Unless and until it does so, it will continue to be vulnerable to trade threats from China or from other countries in the world. But for all this to come together, Indian industry has to get its act together. At the same time, government too has to do its bit to reduce the cost of capital to Indian business and walk the talk on ease of doing business. Unless and until we see a convergence of all these circumstances, India will continue to be vulnerable. The time for procrastination is over. The trade clock is ticking. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to StratNews Global on YouTube. Hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any updates. And please do share your thoughts, ideas and suggestions with us. I'm available on Twitter at Capital Calculus. I'll be back next week with another episode. Till then, stay safe.